what we're going to do today is just have a bit of a regulation refresher for everyone. I know we're a bit down the road from good old Brexit, but it will keep coming back to haunt us all, and just cover off a few things in terms of obligations, export, importers, exporters, downstream users, transport, and talk a little bit about Northern Ireland, and then take a quick look at the markings. And then there will be the opportunity for you to ask questions at the end. We may not be able to answer them all live, depending on the complexity, but we will take them all away and come back to you with a complete answer as we possibly can. So who are Red Online and what do we do? So today we have myself, I'm sales director for Red Online for UK and Ireland, and we have my colleague Helen, who is one of our EHS legal specialists working in the UK for Red Online. Red Online are a business that's been established since 1999. We operate across 92 countries globally currently. And what we do is deliver tailored and specific environmental, health and safety legal registers for our clients in the UK, Ireland and beyond. We deliver the information for our clients tailored to their activities and their locations using a very simple, intuitive system and our expertise that we have in every country that we operate in, with teams of people like Helen. And that really enables our clients not only to understand what legislation is appropriate for them and applicable to them, but to then use that to manage their compliance. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Helen to take you through today's session.
Thank you so much, Susan. So today, as Susan explained so well, we're going to be looking at the impacts of Brexit on chemical regulations. And more specifically, the way we're going to go through this session is first look at the legislation in itself, look at some of the changes and how they've come to be, and just remind ourselves of what the goal of these legislations are originally and why they're important in how we manage chemicals in any ways on site. In our second part, we'll look more at a practical side. We'll look at why it impacts and how it impacts differently different users in the chemical management system. So we'll go through all of them. And then we'll look at how Northern Ireland is slightly different from the rest of Great Britain and explain that in a bit more detail. At several points during this presentation, you'll also be solicited to answer some polls, so please do take part. The goal is for us to also be able to tailor and speak a bit more about things that are more interesting to you. So you will see it after we've done our regulation refresher. So let's go straight on into our regulation refresher. So first, which regulations are we talking about today, and why are we looking at specifically these three regulations? So the main three that we'll focus on are the big names, the big three that everyone has heard of, hopefully, and has been dealing with for a while. The reason why we'll be looking at them as well is because they're the ones that are primarily impacted by the fact that the UK has left the EU, because these originally are EU regulations. So they come from a common system at the EU level that was implemented within the UK. And now that the UK has left, the UK has had to re-implement a separate system. In some ways, it's still very similar to what existed in the EU, but it is a separate and distinctive system, which means that the obligations that you may have changed, which means that the authorities you are contacting and in touch with to stay in compliance may have changed. And it means that from this point on, from the separation between the UK and the EU, there will be more and more differences, because the systems which originally were one and the same will now become two distinctive systems with two distinctive authorities that are managing what is included, which chemicals are looked at, and what has to be reported on. So these big three regulations, of course, we have the REACH regulations, the registration, evaluation, authorization, and restriction of chemicals regulation that was passed in 2006. So it's been going on to nearly 20 years, we'll say. We've got the CLP regulations, the classification, labeling, and packaging regulations that were passed in 2008. And then we had the PIC regulations, the prior and informed consent regulations. All three look at different aspects of chemical management. REACH regulations are more geared towards actual producers and manufacturers because you're evaluating risks at that level. CLP regulations are more geared towards exporters and people who, and users actually, because you're enabling people to understand what risks are. And then PIC are actually also for exporters and importers, because this is when you're requiring consent from authority to import a specific kind of chemical in the location you're at. 3 other things I wanted to mention and that will be mentioned during this presentation, which is why I'm starting and have them on this list. You have, of course, the Global Harmonized Standards, the GHS, which was at the basis of the CLP regulations. So this is a list that was compiled at the UN level. So if you look at jurisdictions, you go from the very international with these global harmonized standards that are common across the world to then CLP regulations that were established at the EU level to implement these harmonized standards and go further for some of them. And now you have distinctive systems where now you have a separate UK CLP and, or more specifically, a separate Great Britain CLP and your EU CLP. You've got your safety data sheets, which are common in most places, but what you have in the safety data sheets will start to change slightly now with EU regulations versus UK regulations. And we've got our European waste classifications, or as it is called in the UK and Great Britain, the list of wastes. So these are the main chemical regulations we're going to be looking at, and the main areas of law we're going to be looking at in this first part, and then explaining more in our second part of the discussion. So first, let's look a bit more at the principles of REACH and the main duties in REACH. REACH, the primary aim of REACH is to ensure the protection of human health and the environment while using chemicals by making clear risks associated with the use of these chemicals. And the duties that are associated with this are about registering the properties of these substances and their uses to enable the safe handling practices, safe storage practices, essentially to ensure, once again, the protection of human health and the environment. This also is very useful because it allows different companies and different users and producers to also share knowledge. And that's another thing that REACH does very well. The idea is that for one substance, you will have one registration. And in this common registration, this unique registration, you also have information about what tests have been done as to limit and try and improve the knowledge that we have around the impacts of substances on human health and the environment. So that is what the REACH initially was for and is still doing. That is, these principles apply both to the UK and the EU. They have not changed. What is changing and what has changed are more in the application of REACH and how we're actually registering things. So the main changes in terms of law when looking at products that were manufactured or mixed in the UK is that the highest authority that a substance has to be notified to is now the HSE. Within the UK and specifically Great Britain, that will be the HSE. You've got a whole lot of considerations around products that had been registered with an EU registration and that now need to either be grandfathered in to these new regulations at the UK level, or have to be produced elsewhere and therefore have their own individual substance registration as a chemical that is now produced not in the EU but within the UK. Grandfathered registrations have technically closed. There are several deadlines that have gone by. There are still ways of looking into them. We'll talk about this a bit more further in the presentation. And I have compiled a list of different resources for people you can contact, and deadlines is what they mean. So once again, the grandfathered registration are chemicals and registrations that were at a EU level that needed to be transferred into this new UK system of the UK REACH in order to ensure that the information that is needed and required when registering a product is registered within the UK system. The last thing that you may need if a product is manufactured as mixed in the UK is a consideration for authorized representatives within the EU market should you be selling to the EU market. As with most of these, you need an official legal entity in either jurisdiction to represent the products and therefore take on some of the registration obligations in each jurisdiction. So if you're producing in the UK, you do need someone in the EU that is now the authorized representative. And that is applicable in the other way. So if we're looking at anything that was mixed manufactured in the EU, now in the UK, you'll need what is called an only representative, which is the equivalent of an authorized representative for the Great Britain market specifically. Once again, the idea is that you need one entity, legal entity, that will take on the responsibilities of the registration. And so that's the last thing, is that things that were mixed in the EU now will need an additional registration within the UK to be used in the UK, which is not something that you needed to do before, because if it was coming from the EU, it had an EU registration and that was okay for the UK. Now it's separate systems, so you need separate registrations. So that's all about REACH. And so we'll now look more at CLP regulations, so classification, labeling, and packaging. So the aim of the CLP regulations is to create a harmonized system that allows us to communicate on the properties of substances, and that includes, of course, safe packaging, safe handling, et cetera, et cetera. As I explained before, the duties are based on what a level of the process you're at. The classification is generally done by manufacturers or importers, and this responsibility falls specifically on those categories of users. Labeling can be done at pretty much any stage, depending on if there's a change to the way in which the substance is used, or if it's mixed again. So many different users are doing labeling. This number will increase because now you're going to have the idea that it has to be labeled according to the laws of the market that you're entering. So if you, and we'll look at this a bit more, if you're entering the EU market from with a substance that was mixed and manufactured in the UK, your labeling will have to also be in accordance to the EU CLP regulations. Packaging is the same. You might see changes based on which level you might be repackaging. The idea is always that CLP, you have to adhere to what is safe to do based on the information you're given with the CLP regulations. And so in terms of actual changes, you have to look at several things. One of the first things to know is whether your, well, if your chemical has been mixed in the UK, and if the actual registrant is a GB-based registrant, or if they're a Northern Irish registrant, which implies differences in the labeling. And of course, you have to make sure that you're looking at the most recent labeling mandates. And there have been some minute changes, but some changes still within the UK. And so that's something definitely to watch out for. So some of the icons and pictograms have changed within since Brexit. So definitely something to look for. When you're looking at it on the other side, the question is always going to be, you know, there's changes as to who the importer is, and if it was mixed in the EU, was it imported through a third party, or are you the one directly importing it? That changes the responsibility of who has to relabel for the market. If you have to relabel your product, the substances, because you're the first importer in this jurisdiction, you have to adhere to the laws that have to do with your jurisdiction. So if you're importing a product from the EU to Great Britain, and there's not anyone else in between you and the producer, you're going to have the responsibility to change the labeling so that it's in accordance with the new GB CLP regulations. And that includes, of course, it has to be up to the standards that are set out by Great Britain, and of course registered with the HSE, because the HSE is now the highest registrant authority for products coming into the UK, and specifically Great Britain, of course. So now we've looked at this legislation, this piece of legislation, CLP, which I know it's quite a lot still, but we all have worked with these for a long time. So not to worry too much. It's a lot of changes that have to do with who is notifying, what is on the label, and it's minute changes still, and who are you notifying to, essentially who the authority is. The last piece of legislation I mentioned before is the PIC regulations. So prior informed consent is required, and it requires an explicit is the keyword consent for importing or exporting a specific list of chemicals. This entered into force in 2004 following the Rotterdam Convention. And this is maybe something that we had to think about less before, because the PIC regulations we were following, which were the EU PIC regulations, essentially said, so long as it says it stays in the EU, there's not that responsibility. But now we're not in the EU anymore. So anyone who was shipping or importing between the UK and, or rather Great Britain and the EU, did not have that obligation. However, now that's changing because the UK is not in the EU anymore. So these obligations now exist. You have to obtain explicit consent from the authorities to import or export specific chemicals that are listed in the amendments or in in the schedules that are in the legislation, the PIC legislation. So you've got both the UK PIC and you've got the EU PIC. The list, I don't have the list here, but I will, of course, we've linked the list in the resources, so you are more than free to go and look at those, but definitely something to watch out for. So that's the main change is, are you now an importer? So do you have to obtain that authorization because you're now importing from the EU rather than just shipping within the EU? And that's the general consideration that you'll have when it comes to things that have to do with exchanges between the EU and the UK. So this was the part that we were looking at, all of the legislation and more of the legislative changes. We're going to do a poll now before we go into more of the practical side of things. So there's a couple questions. The reason we're asking you these is so we can see who's around and get a better idea of what might be of interest to you to know a bit more about. So we'll give it a couple minutes. And in the meantime, if you've already answered the poll questions, you can start putting questions into the chat box if I'm correct. So we'll give it another 20 seconds. So please, if you want to answer, now's the time. Okay, so I think we're gonna end the poll. So I can see the results. I'm not sure if I can move it to my screen. So most of you are responsible for the registration of, or more than half of you are responsible for the registration of chemicals in GB, so in Great Britain. Some of you are responsible for it in both Great Britain and the EU, and a couple of you are only responsible for it in the EU. You can also see that the majority of you are not carrying out the classification of any substances on site. So a lot of you are probably users. And finally, most of you have not had a chance to review your risk assessments or your COSH assessments since the end of the transition period, which would have been the 31st of December 2020. So from the 1st of January 2021, we had finished the transition period. Thank you so much for answering those. So we're going to now look a bit closer at what that actually means, what these changes mean for you as a user or in your actual practice on the practical side of things. So first, we're going to look at impacts in Great Britain, and then we'll do a special couple minutes on the Northern Ireland case, because Northern Ireland, as with many things linked to Brexit, is not included in most of the major changes that are happening in Great Britain. So going into these impacts on Great Britain. The first and main thing, if you just remember one thing from this presentation today, is that your status as a user may have changed. Your status under these chemical regulations may have changed since Brexit. Why? Because where you might have been only a user in the past, where you might have just gotten your supplies from a supplier in the EU and gone along your merry way, now you might be considered an importer because your supplier is still in the EU and you're in Great Britain, which is not part of these common regulations. Even if they've not changed that much in practice, your status may have changed. So if you remember just one thing from today, check if your status may have changed or not. So a bit further down, let's drill down into what some of these things you have to remember to look for each type of user are. If you're a producer, manufacturer, or exporter, you want to make sure that the registration of your substances is with the correct authority. And should you need it, you also want to make sure that you have now either an authorized representative in the EU or an only representative in Great Britain to be able to market and therefore export your goods to another jurisdiction. you essentially need someone to represent you in the markets that correspond to the registration you have. If you're doing exports, you also need to notify the authority. So this is all the PIC regulations, which before didn't really concern us all that much because we were part of the same system. Now, because we're a separate system, we need to think about those things, including if we need to further register and require consent to either export or import based on where you are. And if the chemicals that you are using, the substances you are using, are on the lists of notifiable substances. And the last question you have to look at, and the things you have to ask yourself, is about labeling. Are you labeling according to the correct market standards? If you are in Great Britain, have you reviewed the way in which you label your chemicals since Brexit? Have you changed it to match the new regulations or the amended regulations of the UK REACH and the UK CLP? So these are the considerations you have to have for this first phase of the product life. And so we'll look at all the phases. So you're looking here at the first phase, which is the production. Then we'll look at the next phase, which is distribution or importing. So the way that I'm using these words, and most people do use them this way, is as is listed on the screen. So a distributor would be someone who is supplying within the same market. So they're not exporting, they're not sending to another market and another jurisdiction the products that they're using or putting on the market. Most of the obligations, if you're a distributor, remain on the manufacturer. You of course have a duty of care, so you have to check that they're conform, but you're not the one who is normally changing labeling or changing safety data sheets or anything like that. So your duty is to make sure that it corresponds to the market that you're selling it on. Whereas an importer has a different kind of obligation. As an importer, meaning if you are bringing a supply from another market, so if you are based in, let's say, Italy, and you're now buying chemicals or substances that are registerable under REACH from the UK, you would become an importer of substances that were manufactured outside of the region. And so you become responsible for some of the registration. So both ensuring that the registration is done with the EU authorities, but also making sure that your labeling corresponds to what it should be for the EU market. And vice versa. So making sure that if you're importing chemicals or substances registerable under REACH, and I'm using those interchangeably, but if you're importing those substances, you become responsible for certain things, and that these are the things that you would be responsible for. This, of course, depends on if you are being recognized as now one of the only authorities or the only representative. Authorized representative or only representative for the companies that are based in the other location. But there are additional duties and things you have to look for more now because of the separation between the systems. So now we've looked at essentially getting the products to your site. So now, as a downstream user, what should you be concerned about? What are the questions you should be asking yourselves? The first thing is to know, where are you getting your supply? Is it manufactured in the UK? Is it manufactured, or more specifically, is it manufactured in Great Britain? Is it manufactured in Northern Ireland? Is it manufactured in the EU? Is it manufactured elsewhere? Then you want to look at your existing stock. Normally, you should be fine with your existing stock. You will have probably notified the HSE at the moment of import prior to this that you were using these chemicals. So normally you should have no additional duties. Are you using chemicals that are under a grandfather authorization? If so, have you notified the Health and Safety Authority? this is the reverse side. This is, are you continuing to import chemicals that were registered at the EU level and need to be registered in the UK, have potentially been registered by someone else, probably, and therefore are you continuing to use those? And if so, have you notified the HSE that you're still using those? Because there is a duty to do so, to notify that you're still using these for a certain number of years. So there's the first deadline went through. It was in October 2021, but there are several other deadlines that are coming up, and there is going to be this year another consultation on whether or not these grandfathered authorizations should be changed and how they should be impacting downstream users. So look for that in the next couple months. It's been announced. We don't know exactly when that's going to come up, but that will come up this year. You can essentially notify the HSE that you intend to use products for a certain amount of time. So that's 2, 3, 5 years, maybe 8 years as well. So you have to notify based on how long you intend to use these chemicals for. The next thing that you have to look at as a downstream user is the labeling and making sure that the labeling on your chemicals that you're now using, the ones that you're buying currently, is accurate. So are you getting the correct information that you need in order to update and make sure that your cost assessments are correct, and make sure that your icons are correct, and make sure that your safety data sheets are correct, because you do still have an obligation of record keeping. And this obligation currently is still 10 years. So definitely something to look for. So these are things that are linked. You want to make sure that you're still getting all that information and keeping that information as a downstream user, as you were doing before. The only thing that's changing is really who are you reporting to. And finally, that's the big question is, are you now an only representative? So have you been appointed by a company or entity outside of Great Britain as a representative for their product? And if so, you're not really just a downstream user anymore. You also have additional duties. So you want to make sure that you're becoming a distributor at least. So you want to make sure that you are aware of if you've been put or if you've been considered as an only representative. So those are the questions and the things you want to look at when you're using these chemicals and using these products. So finally, we're going to quickly look at the last area that is in any cycle of product cycle, waste. You bought your product, you used them, and now you have some waste. So what should you look at? Is there any changes with hazardous waste? The answer is yes. There's actually been one change or a couple of little changes to the list of waste codes. The list of waste codes are the codes that you use to give information about the properties of any substance that is considered as hazardous waste. So that would go on your consignment notes or anything like that. So you definitely want to check that you have the most recent version of these codes. And we have, of course, listed a link or given you a link in the slide that we'll be able to circulate with all the information about this. So in GB, that's the case. Of course, as with any other part of this presentation, I'm going to say the same thing. Destination is critical. Essentially, you have to know which market, which jurisdiction you're shipping from, shipping to, importing to, exporting from. So where is your waste going? Because it's the same as with the PIC regulations. Whereas before, you would have been potentially sending waste within the EU. We're not in the EU anymore. So that means that your obligations are changing. You're actually shipping, it's transboundary waste management now. You're going beyond the borders of the jurisdiction that you're in. So that's another thing to think about when you're thinking about how has Brexit changed the way in which we manage on a day-to-day basis our chemicals. So these were all the changes for Great Britain, or at least a condensed version of the major changes for Great Britain. So we'll quickly look at Northern Ireland. I know that I don't think many of you are in that area, so I'm going to go fairly fast. The thing to note is that, like with many other things with Brexit, Northern Ireland is for the most part still using EU regulations. So that means that when you're producing or exporting any goods intended for Northern Ireland, you have to make sure that they correspond to the intended market. So if the intended market is Northern Ireland, that still follows the EU. So you have to have EU labeling. If the intended market is Great Britain, it has to follow Great Britain's new labeling and just in general obligations. There are, of course, facilitated exchanges, so there's no import duties or there's not any tariffs or things like that. But you still have obligations to register or at least notify the HSE, and there's still different things that have to happen because Northern Ireland is following the EU system versus the Great Britain system. And that's the same answer with importing. So if you're importing to Northern Ireland, you have to make sure that it's following the EU regulations and not the GB regulations. If we're looking as a downstream user, it's always going to be the same questions. Is it marked in accordance with the market? So for Northern Ireland, it has to be marked in accordance to EU REACH standards and CLP standards. And with waste, you're still using the EU waste classification instead of using the list of waste. So you want to make sure you're still following those codes. So that was a general overview of what the changes have been on chemical management in the three main regulations and how that might impact you at a user level or any level you're at. Once again, the main thing to remember is that your status under these regulations may have changed. So you will want to ask yourselves if it has and how that is going to impact the way in which you manage your chemicals on a day-to-day basis. I wanted to spend a couple minutes just going back over some other things, and this is mostly primarily markings. There's many other things, but this is another thing to look out for and an easy thing to look out for. Markings saying that a product is safe for use in a specific market and corresponds to the safety requirements of a specific market are generally marked with these different symbols. So for the GB markets, you have to have a UKCA marking. If the products were produced after the end of the transition, by now we're a year and some off since the end of the transition. You probably have exhausted most of your old supplies. So if you are using anything or producing anything currently that was bought recently, it should have a UKCA marking. The CE marking is still for EU markets. The thing to note is that there is a UKNI marking. This UKNI marking is intended for Northern Ireland markets. The specificity of this one is that it has to always be applied with the CE marking. And that's where you can remember and you can see that connection between the regulations that are still EU regulations in Northern Ireland versus the GB regulations in the rest of in Great Britain, essentially. So that's just a little tidbit around markings, something to watch out for if you are buying new products now and you have exhausted your stock of anything that was placed on the market before the end of the transition period. So some final notes, and I hope this has been useful for you. This is kind of a review of a couple of things to check. So things to check, as I said, first thing always, has your status changed under chemical regulations? Are you still only a downstream user? To determine this, these are the questions that you can look at. What is the origin of the substance? Is your registration or is the chemical registered in your market denotification period. So this is when you're using products. If you are using products that have for origin the EU, you should have still been able to notify it to the HSE with the deadline that was the 28th of October. However, notification is still possible, and we've added the link to this in the next slide. For grandfathering in, so this is when it was EU, so also EU registered chemicals that we were using in the UK, you had to add it to the new system. So this is when you're adding chemicals to the UK REACH system by grandfathering them in. The original deadline was the 30th of April 2021, so nearly a year ago. You can get in touch with the HSE if you have any concerns. There is a specific and devoted mailbox and a team to look at these issues of whether or not something needs to still be grandfathered in, meaning if it needs to still be added into the UK REACH regulation network database system. The other thing to look for, of course, is around labeling and classification. Does it correspond to your intended market or the market you're in? And then you want to also make sure that you've reviewed your cost assessments. Have you checked for changes to authorized representative, only representative? So all those information labels that you would have you updated those on your safety sheets, etc.? And then if there's any changes to pictograms that have to do with the protection of human health and the environment. So all of those hazard labeling, if that has been put up to date for your cost assessments. And the last area to check is to review your waste codes and just make sure there's not been any changes for your specific waste codes since the end of the transition period. And the last update to this was in late October 2021. So this is kind of checklist for you guys. We'll circulate it, of course, so you can look at what needs to be done, if there's anything that needs to be done on your side. And so some of the resources, all of these links are directly sending you back to the appropriate pages. So we'll circulate this to you if you need more information directly from the official sources. So without further ado, we're gonna go into before we go into Q&A, I think that we have someone intervening now.
Yeah, thank you very much, Helen, for that in-depth presentation. Just before we go into the Q&A session, we have been joined today by our immediate past president, James Quinn, who's in the meeting. And I'd like to invite James to come off mute and do a brief introduction and a quick overview of his presidential views and so on before we go into the Q&A session. It will only be a very, very short intro. James, are you there?
Yep, here, Brenton. How are you doing, my friend?
I'm very well, James. Great to see you. Thank you for joining. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Oh, wonderful pleasure to be here as always. You know, you're working at 120 miles an hour when you're the president, and then next minute you're the IPP and you're sort of really slowing down. But I was about to give Matties Rubis a hard time there, because as soon as you mentioned my name, he switched his screen off, and I thought, Matties, not good. He switched his straight back on again, so he's back in the good. But you see all the things going ping, 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 ping whenever somebody from the potential team comes on. But no, a pleasure to be here as ever. There's a few Matties Rubis. What's going on?
I think there was an issue. Well, not an issue. I think most of the registrations from Red Online have come through in Matties Rubis's name. so I just admitted them all. So I'm sure they've all got their own individual names, but they're all Matties Rubis's today.
Cool name though, to be fair. I'd probably want that as well. So yeah, it's just a quick update as ever, Brenton. I'll be honest, for those of you that are, you know, hopefully all of you are IOSH members, but there's usually some, you know, sometimes you might have some guests coming in, but basically I was a little bit worried. I didn't see a lot of stuff in the IOSH magazine this month on branches and groups and our members in the presidential team. And you know, one of the things that I always like to talk about when I come on as part of the presidential team as president-elect, president or immediate past president, is the amount of amazing work our branches do, and none other than this amazing branch in Essex. And one of the things that I love about this branch as well is when we meet face to face, and a lot of people don't know this, is that when I started off as a chef back in 1985, part of my commis chef apprenticeship was in the Ivy Hill Hotel in Margaretting, where we yeah. some of our meetings. And I left there in 1987 to join the army in Chelmsford, and then spent the next few years down south. So it's one of the reasons why I always remember the Essex branch. And I think we might have a past president on. I don't know if Ray's here today, but I'm sure there's a couple of council members or past council members or members on here anyway as well. If there's not, I apologise. So what are we doing? Presidential team are out and about. We're already getting lots of invites to the face-to-face meetings, which is absolutely outstanding. Going out there, I'm off to Liverpool in the next few weeks. We've got Louise has already been at the Chiltern branch. You've got Lawrence is going out, the vice presidents. Everybody is going everywhere. So hopefully you're going to see a lot more of us, and as we begin to open our doors. Yes, absolutely, Brent, and then see a lot of us at the AGMs, which would be fantastic. It's my intention to get to as many as possible, be it virtually, as I did last year, and in line with Sunita's wishes, as our presidential team rotation allows. Some of the stuff that's going on at the moment behind the scenes, I'll talk a little bit about council as well as presidential team, is the council's changing. Louise's year, in my year when I came in, I decided that we need to utilise council a lot more. We need to break down the barriers a lot more. We needed to work with the board of trustees a lot more, and IOSH leadership team a lot more. And Louise has continued that on, albeit slightly more formally now within council. There's 4 specific areas in council, 4 specific chairs within council that are doing a lot of work in terms of the steering groups, and they're going particularly well, talking about member representation, talking about governance, and how we lead in and how we all work with each other in this great, without using it, the operational word, how council and the presidential team can all help each other. From a presidential perspective, Louise is getting out and about as often as much as she can. Like I said, we're going to all the meetings, and we're going to get to all those meetings as well. But one of the key things that we've been talking about as well, is Louise's key messages in terms of sustainability, inclusivity, diversity, which is, as you know, if you know Louise as our president, is very, very committed to that. And again, we have International Women's Day today, so happy International Women's Day to all our members today. We also have the Catch the Wave. And the Catch the Wave, as I've been saying to everyone, Brenton, is that it's about the stuff that we're already doing now. So if you're a health and safety practitioner, and you've been doing health and safety for a few years, and especially the last couple of years, you can't tell me one of our profession that has not learned something new and has not been so valuably used within whatever industry they're in. I'm in construction, retail, transport, theatre. Look at all the groups that has not had an impact. And why would you not have an IOSH health and safety professional within your business to help you with all the amazing resources that we've got at the back of us to help this Catch the Wave? And let's be honest, even though Catch the Wave is this great new initiative from IOSH, there's not one person in this call that would have not already been catching that wave, albeit they've been calling it something else. It's people, and it's people. Remember, my brand, if you want, and my sort of quotations was about members, members, members. And now Louise will take it on to people, people, people. I don't know what Lawrence Webb's got in mind when he becomes president, but we'll wait to see what his 3 words will be. So just a quick update, Brenton. It's going well. Presidential team are out and about. Louise is doing great work behind the scenes. You might not see her as much as you saw me, but remember, my role was different in COVID. It was about reaching out to everyone while we were in the darkness. Now that we're coming into the light, It's now Louise's turn to shine in terms of getting all that great governance stuff done. And then you have that amazing person, Lawrence Webb, coming through as well through that CDM quotation, we like to use the golden thread. So lots of great things happening. Presidential team are working hard. We're there for you as always. Please, if you have any issues at all, as a member, get in touch with Brenton. He will give you the presidential team mailbox. In turn, you can find me on LinkedIn, contact me there as well as your immediate past president. So hand back to you, Brenton. Thank you so much, Helena. Was it Helene? Helene, I heard most of that. Very, very interesting. Thank you, Brenton.
Yeah, thanks for joining us today, James. A pleasure to have you as always. We'll just move on now into the Q&A session, and I'll ask Sarah from our committee if she's collated some of the questions. We probably won't have time to get through all of them done, but we will do our best to answer everything that's asked and get an answer back to everybody. So can I just hand over to Sarah and to field a few of the questions to the presenter?
Yeah, no problem. Thank you, Brenton. Yeah, we'll just start off with a couple on safety data sheets. So we've just had one for chemicals being imported from the UK to the Republic of Ireland. Do you have to change any documentation such as safety data sheets upon arrival?
So that's the responsibility of the importer to make sure that you're following the rules of your jurisdiction. So for the EU, there's a slightly, it's minute changes, but one of the main examples is going to be your authorized representative. So who are you contacting should you have an issue, which would be normally on your safety data sheet as well. That will change because you need someone in your jurisdiction. So yes, there will be some small changes. Those changes will be the responsibility of generally the authorized representative or the importer, and that's why I've been saying again and again, know which type of user you are, because your responsibilities may have changed.
Great. I've got another one here. Relabeling required for all imports, or can you treat importation for sale different to importation for direct use?
It's the same as with the previous question. A lot of these are going to be the same. It has to still be in accordance to the local legislation. So if you're importing and you're responsible for importing, you're still going to have to do the extra steps of registering. So you're probably going to need to change some of the documentation that goes with it and save the documentation as any user would.
I've got one here. I've missed the deadlines for grandfathering EU REACH registrations. Can I still start the process?
Yeah, as of now, the information that we've seen is that you can contact the HSE and bring yourself into compliance. So there is a way of doing so. As we said before, grandfathering is when you are transferring a product that was registered in the EU under REACH into the UK system under the UK REACH system. And so the process and the deadline was last April, but there's, of course, everyone understands there's sometimes some issues. So there is a way to contact the HSE and get the process started to make sure that you're in compliance with that.
I've got one here more about REACH. We're planning to import chemicals over 1 tonne from outside the UK and EU. Where do we stand with regards to our obligation under REACH and registration?
So that's going to depend on where you are, but the registration is going to be the same as you would need for the EU. If you're thinking about it, actually, so if you're importing from outside of the UK, you will have to register with the HSE under the GB REACH and CLP regulations, and that's going to be the same whether it's coming from the EU or coming from elsewhere in the world. The advantage, or with the EU, you have this grandfathering in process that exists, which might make it slightly easier, especially because the EU follows a similar process. So you have the information in the very similar way, but you will still need to register it as you would regardless of the origin of the product.
Okay, I think we've got time for a couple more. We're a manufacturer of resin product that uses substances, but we do not manufacture chemicals. Where do we stand with regards to making REACH declaration?
That's going to depend on if you're importing, if you're exporting, who's asking you for the information. In general, the best is to go back to the HSE and make sure you're compliant. There's a lot of information about downstream users, especially with this idea that you might have changed status with the changes to the importing system. But it's one of those where we would need more information for it to be entirely accurate. So my advice is check with the HSE. That's probably the first protocol for anyone that has those types of questions.
Okay. And then, yeah, just finally, would these markings or the new markings, would they be on the safety data sheet only, or will they also be on the product packaging, or both?
They'll probably be on both, and it's going to depend on when the product was actually manufactured and the type of manufactured products. There are some exemptions for pharmaceutical products, so depending on which types of substances, even if they might have been registered under REACH, they might have a separate labeling and marking system. So definitely something to check on. But in general, it'll be both on the safety data sheet and on the actual packaging.
Yeah. And then I think you said before we started that if there's any more specific questions, that's something you'd be able to get back to.
Yeah.
But
we'll definitely, and I think that's the note for anyone who sees on their camera that they're named Mathis Fabrice. If we don't have your information, we can't contact you. So please do make sure that you're changing your name or adding contact details, because otherwise there's no way for us to answer. Thanks.
Beautiful. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Sarah. And again, Helene and James. Thank everybody for giving this time up to attend yet another great session. And we look forward to seeing you at our next session and welcoming you all back. Really, really great session today, guys. Thank you, everybody, for your input today, and have a great rest of the day.